Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to this episode of the Life with a Y interview series podcast. This is the interview series where we find out why people do what they do, and today we have the second part of a three-part deep dive into the life of Gabrielle Blackwell. Today's episode is different. There are a number of things different. Firstly, today is our very first audio-only episode. Secondly, today's episode is long. When I came out of my conversation with Gabrielle after recording this episode, the end file was 2.5 hours long. Now, don't worry, I wasn't going to subject you to 2.5 hours of our conversation, but the way that today is going to work is that I'm going to pop up and pop in and out after having cut out specific sections. So I'll give context for specific sections, I will allow Gabrielle to explain her piece on particular pieces, and I'll give some commentary as we go through. This is a new format for the podcast. If you like it, let me know, and if you don't, please do let me know. Funnily enough, the reason that today's episode was so long is with an hour and a half left to go in the recording, I asked Gabrielle, so I have one last question for you. And if you want to find out what that is, you're going to have to listen to the rest of the episode. But she goes on to describe an event in her life that is really pivotal. She goes on to describe something that caused her to have the breakdown that she mentions in episode 1. And unfortunately, it is a story that is more common than should be. I get the feeling that there are many people who will have a story similar to this who won't have a platform like this to talk about it. I ran the first half of this episode as per usual, but as you'll see, there is no way of cutting a story like this short. So, that is why today's episode is so long. If you need to do it in pieces, please do, but please do listen to it all, because it's a very important story that needs to be told. Today, we learn why somebody deconstructs the patterns of their own mind, why somebody challenges their own beliefs and leads to challenging their own beliefs, and how somebody reacts to a very particular incident that unfortunately is more common than it should be. With that being said, welcome to this episode of the Life with a Y interview series. Let's crack into it. Gabrielle Blackwell, welcome back to the second episode. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm all good. Different background, different life, different country, but hey, that's how this works.
Different background, same life, same country.
Nice one. I'm glad that we're kind of different.
Same house, different room.
But you still got Luna.
I still have Luna. Luna is passed out on the bed,
Chilling, living her best life. I'm quite
absolutely. Made her a blanket fortress for her to sleep on. So here, I'll give you a little sneak peek of the doggo right over there.
Again, anybody listening to this needs to watch the actual video because that was very cute. Today I would like to chat a little bit more about the first half of your life. Or when I say half, it's more so the first 90%, but hey.
Yes.
And what we talked about last week, by the way, anybody listening, if you have not listened to last week's episode, really stop this now, go back to it. A lot of this won't make sense unless you have some of our background. But last week, we talked about your life as a whole, the journey that you've been on, the different sections that you've had. We kind of touched on a couple of different impacts. So the impact of your family, the impact of your work, the impact of knowing yourself, how you came to that. There was a very specific turning point. And again, I feel like we chatted a lot and touched on a lot of different icebergs, but never actually delved really deep into anything other than your transformation. We did look at that, but everything else, everything that led up to it, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. There was a very specific period in your life that we talked about last time, and you mentioned it as 10 to 27.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll kind of classify this period as not knowing who you were, or your ideas to who you weren't necessarily the reality. You kind of lost touch with yourself. And that is the area that I'd like to talk about today. My goal is that at some stage you mention something that registers in the brains of one of our listeners, and they might realize that they're in that moment of their lives without necessarily knowing it. But there were quite a few things that happened during that time that I'd love to look at, and not necessarily look at what happened, but more so look at the reactions that you had and how you internalized these things and how they looked to the outside as compared to what was going on inside.
Yep.
So that's kind of what we're gonna look at today, the sort of pre-transformation, Gabriella 1.0. But there is a
Gabrielle
question,
MVP.
the OG. But there is one question that I'd like to ask before we sort of crack into anything. Last week, we talked for the guts of an hour about all of the different turning points and changes in your life. And I found it really interesting that not once did you mention your divorce. So, because that's typically a massive changing, that's typically a massive turning point. There's something drastically wrong that people need to change. And then that becomes a catalyst. Okay, I need to remove myself from this, which changes all of this. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting that that didn't come up. So I'd love to ask, what didn't change with the divorce? How come that wasn't a catalyst moment for you?
Yes. So I think there was a catalytic impact of it, right? Hey, listen, there was this I think there was something that I was pursuing when I went to Paris, when I got married, and there was a recognition that, wow, I'm pursuing something. Number one, I didn't recognize that I was pursuing it. Number two, I didn't know where to get it. And so I'll walk you through an experience that I had. And I think this was really, it wasn't the fact that I got divorced, that I left my ex. It was, all right, I was having a terrible, terrible time in this relationship, right? He was emotionally abusive. He attempted to be physically abusive. He was very, very absent, right? I was working so many jobs, I couldn't get anywhere. And then, I'd come home and all my cash would be gone, right? So um, there was that experience that I had. And I remember it got so bad to the point where I lost my appetite. I couldn't actually stomach food anymore. I stopped, I wasn't sleeping. I would just always be on the move. I think I probably dropped like 15 pounds in a really short amount of time. And I just felt like I was spiraling. And with this, I remember having a conversation with my mom one day, and she's like, Gabrielle, you really should go see someone, like go talk to someone about this. And I went to this therapist. Her name was Marjorie. And I remember in our first session, and I was talking about this marriage, right, that I was in, and like not really knowing what to do and what was going on. I remember she had me do this exercise, and I like this to me was, I think with this divorce, or like with being, it wasn't even just the divorce, it was being with this person, feeling the way that I felt, and then that leading me to this therapist where we did this exercise. And the exercise was, all right, on one sheet of paper, like on one side, put numbers 1 through 20, right? And then she's like, I want you to write down all of the reasons why I married him. His name was Tristan. She's like, write down 20 reasons why you married Tristan. And she's like, I'll give you like 2 minutes to do this. And she's just like, whatever comes up, write it down. And if it comes up 2 times, right, that's totally okay. So I did that exercise, and then at the end of those 2 minutes, she's like, now I want you to spend 45 seconds or a minute and circle the top 3 that are resonating the most. Okay, cool. Now, once I had that, she's like, now I want you to, of those 3, underline the one that resonates the most. And the one that resonated the most was, I married him to be happy. Like, I thought that marrying him would make me happy. So that is like, so I think there's like, that was the truth, right? Of, right, this is like, figuring out like, why do people do the things that they do? For me, I didn't even recognize that I was in this pursuit of happiness. And if I were to flip this, I think why the divorce in and of itself, or all the events that led to it, weren't necessarily a transformational period. It was definitely a stepping stone, but it wasn't, it didn't change anything for me, because I still hadn't yet, I had not yet confronted the fact that it wasn't just a matter of the pursuit of happiness. It was the awareness that I was deeply sad, that I was constantly in a state of mourning, constantly in a state of grief, right? And so the marriage was an effort to try and mask that, but I wasn't actually getting to what is the root cause of that sadness? What's the root cause of the mourning? What's the root cause of the grief, right? Like, what is keeping me from actually being able to move through this? And instead it might have been a marriage, it might have been drinking, it might have been drugs, it might have been like nights of just being an absolute, like, what's the word that I want, degenerate, right? So like, and then I think that, I had left my ex-husband, I came back home to Chicago, and then all of a sudden I'll say this, like, I did throw myself into work. At the time, the awareness that I had was I need to be able to take care of myself. I was in survival mode. I didn't have time to think about my divorce. I didn't have time to think about Tristan. I didn't have time to recognize, oh, wow, I just went through like this hellish relationship. And I think the truth of it was I was kind of used to being in hellish relationships. It's like, okay, well, so there's also that piece too, right? Of like, all right, hey, I find myself in these places, right, where I'm constantly grieving, I'm constantly mourning. I wasn't necessarily growing as a person. Yes, like I had a job. Yes, I could build out my LinkedIn resume or my LinkedIn profile. I could build out my resume. And I realized you asked me one question. I went on a full tangent, but you're gonna take this. So I could do all these things, but what I had to recognize was, like, again, what is the root cause of all these things? And there's this quote that I really do appreciate so much, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's a Lao Tzu quote. And it's like, all right, be mindful of your thoughts, they become your words. Be mindful of your words, they become your actions. Be mindful of your actions, they become your nature. Mindful of that, right? Because essentially it's your destiny. So I've contemplated this quote for years, right? And a couple of years ago, I took the time just to go, well, okay, like, essentially we're saying words are coming from thoughts, but where do thoughts come from? And for me, I was like, and the answer that I came up with was core beliefs about myself. And I recently, I don't see this therapist anymore. I don't go to this therapist anymore, but the most recent therapist that I had, one of the things that he talked to me about quite a bit was there are these agreements that we make with ourselves when we're children, right? For example, so we're probably going to get to the point of my dad eventually, but let's say my dad leaves, right? He said, like, it's like I would go over to his house, I'd hang out with him, hang out with my half siblings, right? He drops me off at home. He tells me, hey, listen, I'm going to pick you up. You're going to spend the entire summer with me. I'm like, this is going to be great, right? And then he never shows. Summer over summer over summer, right? So no one's sitting there and going, hey, Gabrielle, the reason that your father did what he did is because of X, Y, and Z. So instead I go, all right, I make up my own reasons. And my reason was, okay, well, he's got 3 kids already. Maybe he doesn't need another one. Maybe I'm not good enough. So, like, for me, I could go into, like, so I'm like, that to me, like, if that core belief still exists, and that shows up, like, it starts with my father, it shows up in my marriage. Okay, like, this person is calling me all crazy kinds of names and yelling at me and screaming at me and is never there and, like, takes all my stuff and it just tries to control me. Maybe I'm just not good enough, like maybe I'm a bad person and this is why I'm getting what I'm getting. And so I essentially rationalize awful treatment. And so that is something that continues with me, right? Because I think what ended up happening was the big wake up call for me was when that, like, because again, I hadn't changed, like me leaving my ex-husband, none of my beliefs changed. Everything on the outside, everything that everyone could perceive, yes, but that's illusion, right? Like, it's like, just, it's illusion, but like at the core of it all, nothing actually changed. So I would continue from, during that 10 to 27 time, right? Or even leaving Tristan, I would continue to find myself in areas or environments where I was receiving really similar treatment and I would go, okay, right? Like, I would acquiesce.
We're going to take a little bit of a jump here now to when Gabrielle starts to talk about the belief that she has and what happens to this belief, the belief that she has had throughout the entirety of her marriage and her divorce. What happens when she meets somebody or meets people that don't conform to that belief.
Right? It's like, this is where I am. I'm stuck, right? I don't even think I know that I'm stuck. I'm like, no, this is just life. Because again, the belief is there. The belief says, I'm not good. I'm bad.
So it was you
Right?
needed
I deserve to be, and so therefore this is punishment for some fatal characteristic about myself that is intrinsic to who I am as a person, right? So like that to me, without actually, so again, like the piece of like the leaving my ex, I think it was that could have been a lesson for me to go, I really need to explore my beliefs, right? You know, like that could have been, like, it's like the hero's journey, right? Like the hero ignores the first call. And there's another call they can't ignore. So like that could have been a call. And I didn't necessarily have I didn't either I was unwilling to, or I didn't know how, right? There was not like to actually be able to receive that signal or better yet, to even know what to do with that signal. Like I know, wow, I know that something's wrong, but I internalized it, right? There's something wrong here. It must be me.
You needed an entire paradigm shift. And the reason that I asked the comfortable question was, and you, I think I used the wrong terminology, but more so what I spotted was the familiarity, like the familiarity of that prison that you talked about, that there was no other way than living inside this way of doing things. People treat me this particular way, and then anything. So if somebody had come into your life that had treated you in a way that wasn't this, that would have been seen as the other. That would have been seen as something
Oh,
different,
I
and then
mean,
that would have been rejected.
right? Like that's probably when we get into these like different attachment styles. I don't always like to talk in the way of, it might be a bit more academic, right? Into like, yeah, a bit like that language, but there's the like anxious, fearful piece of things, right? So if someone, so I think that there can be this piece of, oh, if someone demonstrates sincere kindness and sincere care, I go, what are their ulterior motives? I can't trust them.
In our very first introductory call, in our very first call where we agreed to go on this, you wanted to know what my ulterior motives were for doing this, for doing this podcast. Now that I think
It's
of it,
funny. I was talking to someone recently, and I was there. I think there can be two ways. Like, okay, in the past, there was, oh, someone's being nice. This is weird, right? I think that's so if anything, the way that I think about this, it starts to aggravate the belief, right? So if the belief is like, all right, this belief, this agreement that I made, right, years and years and years and years and years ago, right, and there's all this, excuse my language, all this shit that just piles on top of it, and it just like shields itself. Like I think it's like the Wizard of Oz, like don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, right? So it's like, presents itself as this all powerful Oz kind of thing.
in this next section, I asked Gabrielle how she got into sales, and we talked about that for a little bit. But if I'm being honest, when I go back into my editing, that's something that you can find out on other podcasts, and that's something that you can also find out just on her LinkedIn. We spent the next little while talking about how she got into sales, and in a nutshell, she had decided that the best way to be the person that she wanted to be was to model herself around the idea of being a CEO. She then did some research and realized that a lot of CEOs start in sales. So she took on an SDR job, killed it in the SDR job. Then as her career progressed, she was promoted to an account executive at 2 different companies, and now she's an SDR manager. We still talk about her career in this next section, but rather than asking her, I fell into the trap of asking her a CV question. Instead, what we're going to hear now is a little bit more as to the why and to the emotions around this career piece in her life. Well, how did someone like yourself, whose paradigm has mostly been kindness is suspicious, good things are suspicious, starting in a sales position whereby you're treated somewhat well.
Yeah.
How did that gel?
You know what? So here's the thing. Like I've had folks in my life. I think about this. You know what? I'm glad that you asked this question because real talk, I almost did not accept an offer from that company. Like I
Really?
almost self-sabotaged for real. And it makes me, I was thinking about this the other day and it made me laugh because I remember I applied on a Wednesday and I started my first day that following Wednesday. It was like that, right? And this is after like 2 or 3 weeks of running around like a chicken with its head cut off, interviewing for these other roles, and I never even got past the phone screen, right? So I I think I also remember what was going on with me at that moment. I can actually recall going into that phone interview, right? I had actually met up for coffee with my godmother Vanessa, and I was there was a bunch of stuff that was happening in like personal life, and I was sharing with her about it. And I just remember her going, "Don't you have an interview? Like, do you want to like chill out for a minute before you go into it?" And I was like, you know what? I don't even like at this point. I'm like, I don't even care. Like, I don't even know if this whole sales thing is for me. Whatever. I'm just gonna go in. I'm gonna have some fun, right? And so like, and if they don't want me, like whatever, I'm awesome. Like that's where I was. Like I was like, so like I do think that like I had this it was a bit of like abandon, like but in a positive way, which was I'm just not going to take all this stuff so seriously anymore. Like whatever, who cares if it doesn't work out? That's just another interview out of the 30 that I've done that hasn't worked out. So I think I'm just gonna have to kind of roll with the punches. And so I remember I had a meeting or I had this phone call, and so the hiring manager who ended up being my boss, really great guy, his name's Stan Barr, and we were talking, and I think there was this point in time where I was really trying to like present myself very well, like, all right, I had these abilities and leadership and blah blah. And he goes, listen, I don't give a shit about, and so he swore, and I was like, time out, this man talks like I do. And so like there was just certain things about him where I was having fun, and I think like he created an environment where that fun could happen, and it wasn't just a matter of like it wasn't a matter about the job. It was just more like, you know what, I'm in a place where I'm just not going to take myself so seriously anymore. I'm just going to have some fun with it. And he's like, hey, listen, you're a rock star, you're this, you're that. And also in the background, because he like this was like the one glimmering moment, my life overall, like that was maybe 20% of the goodness or 20% of overall thing. So it's 20% goodness and there's like 80% shit, right? With like family and whatever. So I was like, you know what? It was like a distraction. I'll be honest, like it almost felt a little bit like a distraction from my family crap. It also was kind of like a big middle finger to all my family crap and to my ex, right? All the people who told me that I couldn't do stuff, I had my ability just to be like, you know what? Screw y'all. Y'all suck. I'm out here. I'm about to be on my boss babe shit. Don't like come at me, you know? So I was very much in this again, like I was kind of like I was in like survival mode. I was like, I need a job, I need to go do something, the end. And so I think honestly it was probably favor, right? Like I definitely believe in like the universe and the divine and things like that. And I'm like that to me was fortune, I believe, where I was ready to receive the experience at the time that I needed. But even when I went to go meet up with Dan in person and he offered me the job, I was just like, I legit said, I don't know if I can take this job. And he goes, why not? And I was like, I don't think my mom would approve. I said that in an interview. I said that. And
Um,
he goes, well, let me go talk to your mom. And I was like, this dude is cool.
so I'm not even gonna ask why your mom wouldn't approve, but I would love to know.
Because nobody was approving of anything that I did. So again,
Well,
like it's very much like F you. And I was like, this guy,
one of the
this
things
guy is he's in my camp, you know?
one of the things I'd love to know is why your mom. So why your mom was the first thing that pops into your mind? Like why was I don't think I can take this. I don't think I can do this. And why not? And there are lots of reasons why not. I'm not good enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. I don't know, etc., etc. Particularly when you meet someone like the person that you're describing. Um, the first response is to throw your mom under the bus and be like, "It's mom's fault. It's mom."
don't- so I mean we kind of, I don't know if it's during the episode itself, like when we're recording or when we were having a conversation before we kick things off, this piece of like not really knowing myself and having to, more than anything, please other people, right?
Mhm.
Like that's where I derive my self-worth from. And so, it's me going into sales was it what and it's kind of symbolic, I guess. Like that to me was probably more interesting, right, than even the divorce led me to that, or like leaving, because I didn't finalize the divorce until like a couple years afterwards. But there was this expectation of what I was going to do and who I was going to be and how I was going to make money, right? And even to the point of, oh, hey, Gabrielle, you need to do X, Y, and Z so that you can take care of me when I'm older, right? So it very much was, all right, like, there's this predestined path that you must follow. And I kind of had zero, wow, as I'm saying these things out loud, I'm gonna have to meditate after this episode, like after we're done recording. But
Feel free to
like,
write things down.
yeah, no, I mean, I think there's this piece of I was doing some research yesterday, and the reason why I just even said that, I was doing some research yesterday, and they were talking about like why like individual development plans fail, right? And the number one reason why is because there is no, it's not driven by the individual, right? It's an individual development plan that's not driven by the individual, and that's the number one reason why it fails.
So
And
more so
so
the manager saying this is what I expect of you rather than the rep saying this is what I expect of myself.
exactly.
Okay.
Right? Right, yeah, so it's like, hey, or even just, hey, we can have this exact same expectations for the role, because that should be pretty straightforward, or at least we hope it should be straightforward, right? It's more like, hey, listen, it's the how I get there, right? So, there was no, it wasn't just my mom, it was my family overall, because I was also somebody in my family who, I believe people go, like, they looked at me and they go, wow, you show a lot of promise, you show a lot of potential. I went to a really really good college that was like, it's very renowned for its economics program, right? People from econ will get into like investment banking. So my whole family was like, oh, Gabrielle, like you're gonna make a shit ton of money. And no one actually cared about if I wanted to do that or not. So there was more so of that. It's like, all right, Gabrielle, you need to graduate from school, you need to go to law school, you need to become a lawyer, and if you do these things, then you're going to be happy, right? You're going to get married, and that's what's going to make you happy, versus actually being curious about, all right, hey, like what is it that inspires a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction and joy and happiness within you, right? What is it that makes you feel strong and empowered? And then what are the things that will allow you to express that and to experience that to its fullest? And that should be your path.
We then go on to more, again, CV related things. But I make a quick observation, and that's what the next question is about. Yeah, again, it seems like you've kind of done this thing. This is the only place I can experience this success in. It took you a while to realize that this isn't the only marriage that I can be happy in, that
Yeah, it was
this is the
very
only familial
fixed.
relationship that I can
Yeah,
work with.
it was
Um,
very fixed mindset,
mm,
very fixed mindset. And so I remember, so like, all right, so what ends up happening after that company is, so as I mentioned, the CRO, the VP of, like, they leave, like, yeah, CRO leaves, the VP of sales leaves with him, and they go to this other company, and I go with them, right? I didn't even just go with them. I was just like, I was just, honestly, I had not possessed my own power. That's the best way to put this. Was a lot of my success is dependent upon being at this company with this boss, right? I had not yet, I think that's the piece, right? Even though I can do really well with my abilities, I don't see that as a reflection of me. I see that more as like, I don't accept it. So it's hard about like being able to receive and accept good things. It's not just good things like with other people, it's also the good things about myself, right? So like if I hadn't yet recognized, oh wow, because again, I was going, right? Like I was like, I want to do really great work, I wanted to be the best, right? Like, I don't want there to be any doubts. And that was the number one driver for me, was basically like, if I can shut everybody up, then maybe I'll be safe. Right. So that was a drive, and it had nothing to do with me personally. So it's more like, I think even in that model, if I like it warps, because what ends up happening is like, I had a boss at that time, Dan. I had a leader. I had a leader that I was reporting to, right? That I was following.
Yeah.
And he cared about me as a person deeply, right? I could tell him about what was happening with my family. I could tell him about what was happening with my ex-husband, and he could relate, right? Because there was things that it wasn't the same experience, but there was experiences that he had where we can connect at that level, right? And then also he just let me be as I was, right? He encouraged me. I could be vulnerable. I could be authentic. And I just remember being like, I was like, Dan, I'm like a rock star. And he's like, yes, you are, And it took a lot for me to say that. And I think he recognized that. So I'm getting like emotional now, but like that to me, I don't know, like the model that he demonstrated to me is very much like the legacy that I want to carry on as a leader, right? And that I want to build upon and that I want to get better at. But I think I took it for granted that someone like Dan is a rarity. I didn't know like that not everybody is like that. And so when I went to this next place, even though there was similar leadership, right, that had like hired Dan, and there, especially the VP of sales, his name was Tim. Like Tim was similar, right? He cared about me as a person. He cheered me on. He like even in that next role that I had, because I had been promoted from an SDR, I moved into an AE role, and I was struggling. I'd also gotten into a car accident. I had a really bad concussion. I'd moved out there was a lot of chaos, right? I'd been promoted. There was a lot going on, and there was not a matter of the person that I was reporting to. He was not somebody who took the time to recognize my strengths. He was not the person who was like ultra interested and demonstrated. And I think it was probably just more so like wasn't aware that that was important versus like just willingly not doing it. And so, yeah, so I struggled. I really did struggle, but I had someone like Tim who could like essentially be a sponsor, be a mentor. He introduced me to other people at the organization. So I still had someone who could demonstrate that to me. I ended up actually getting let go from that company despite being like the number one performer in my region, which sucked. And like, having figured something out. And so I think like, and that was, I also, when I got let go from CloudWords, I didn't, whatever. I got let go from CloudWords. I'm saying the names. I got let go from the first company in February or March of that year, and then I got let go from the second company in October of that same year.
These are 6-month stints.
6 months, yeah. So like I had been at that first company for about a year, top performing rep. I'd gone to this new company, transitioned from being an SDR to an AE, had the highest quota attainment, right? Was also in like the top, I was in the top 10%, I think, or yeah, I think I was in like in the top 10% or so, for top 15% for like, there was a couple of other like retention and upsell, right? Like metrics that were happening for AEs too.
Very important.
Yeah, so I was like in that regard, right? I was somebody who's demonstrating exceptional performance in the organization, and I still got let go. And so I think I talked about how like my dad left, and like it's like I didn't have any rationale for it, so I made something up for myself to help myself out. And so I think like, you experience something like that where, again, like March of one year, in March I get let go. Right. I started a new company. I get promoted. I move to a totally new place. A month after that, I think it was June or July, I get into a car accident, right? I get hurled off of out of a moving vehicle, have a major concussion, while still at the same time holding a quota and not taking the time to go on leave, because I'm like, no, if I go on leave, I'm going to let go. Like I have to work the end. And I find my way up to being a top performing rep, right? By October, or by the end of September, and then in October I get let go, right? Then I have to go, holy crap, who was I to believe that I could do this?
Yeah.
Right. And I regress back into that belief set of I'm not good enough, right? Or whatever else it is. Like there's something that I did.
Well, that brings me to the last question of the day.
Okay.
And here we are. This is what I thought was going to be the very last question of the day. And as you can see from the timestamps, it wasn't. There's very little editing from this point onwards because the story that we're about to get is so important. I didn't feel comfortable making the decision, no, this section of this story is not as important as others. If you need to take a break at this stage and to come back to this after a little while, that makes a lot of sense. But please do listen to this next section in its entirety. Up until this point, I had ran this episode like any normal episode. We had talked about quite a few different things. I had a prepared-ish list of questions, and I felt that we had talked about everything that Gabrielle and I had planned on talking about in our prep session for this episode. But then she brings up this section. I had no idea about the story. I had no idea about where it was going to go, and I'm very glad that it's a story that we got to share here. That being said, please enjoy it. Well, as much as one can enjoy a story like this, and I hope it brings a little bit of clarity to what we talked about in episode 1. Here we go. Well, that brings me to the last question of the day.
Okay.
When we talk about your life between the ages of 10 and 27, that ends at the breakdown that we talked about last week, and we kind of delved into the breakdown itself. But what I thought was quite interesting was there was no switch. There was no big, small, major event that happened, notable event that happened that caused this, or at least not one that we talked about.
Oh, there's one.
Oh, there is one.
Yeah.
Was it a straw?
There's probably all of those events.
I was going to ask, was it a large event that tipped, or was it a straw that broke the camel's back?
I believe it was the straw. So I talk about, I think as I've been sharing, what surfaces up for me as a recurring theme is this belief, right? There's something wrong. There's something about me specifically that is not deserving. And there's actually, we didn't get to this, but like I can recall a specific conversation that I have with my dad in particular, where and we talked about the concept of love, because I tried to actually reject him when he came back. I was just like, no, you are not my father. I'm like, you might be my father biologically, but you are not my dad. And he very, very quickly, very, very promptly, I believe, like, misused or abused his position as an adult with a child in saying that I didn't know, that I was a kid and I didn't know anything about love. And so as a child, I internalized that big time. So like I was literally just about to say, I think it wasn't just a matter of this belief of like, all right, I'm not good enough, I'm bad, but I think the underlying piece of this is I am not deserving of love.
You mentioned that last week as well.
Right? So that to me is the thing that keeps on popping up, right? Like that is like that keeps on popping up. And so there was a very extreme event that happened. Like there was a series of little tiny like microaggressions is what I'll call them at this one company that I worked at. And then there was a huge macro one that like so in the past, right before that time, the little micro things, they're so subtle, so nuanced, where I'm like, all right, I know it's having a toll on me, but like maybe it can get better.
So what was that big event?
Yeah. So, all right, I was, there had been a series of things that had happened. There's a company that I worked at. I talked about like there's these microaggressions that were happening. And again, like these were things where it's like they're so subtle, so nuanced. And maybe if I advocate for myself, right, there's an opportunity that these microaggressions will stop. So I was tolerating that experience.
Tolerating, yeah.
Tolerating. And so there was I had surfaced up concerns because there was a particular executive at that company who was a major contributor to the microaggressions that I was experiencing. And I was encouraged to sit down with this executive at the company. And so this is me. I just turned 27 years old. Uh was the youngest leader at the organization as well, had been experiencing all types of microaggressions from different folks. And I was like, at some point in time, they're going to get sick of me, you know? And this was a very, very high ranking executive at the company too. So I remember the day before I was supposed to go and have a conversation with this person. It was facilitated by our HR leader. There was like a sales team outing because it was right around the time of Christmas, right? So it's like, hey, like let's do like a winter happy hour kind of thing. And I was just, you could like my there's folks on my team and they could tell that there was something on my mind. They're like, are you okay? What's going on? You know, coworkers were, you know, friendly. They were like, yo, GB, what's going on? How's it going? And there was one person in particular who would, this is the person who is like, this is the person who's going to show up in a moment. But I just remember I was talking to one of my friends and this person was present, right? They're like, why are you stressing out? Right? What's going on? And I was just like, you know what? Honestly, I have to go and have this conversation with this executive tomorrow. And I'm really, really nervous about it, right? Because this person is, you know, making Black jokes all the time and telling me how they can't be seen walking around. I was living in Portland, Oregon, has a pretty weird history with Black people, but as he had shared they can't be seen walking around with a Black woman in Portland, Oregon.
Jokingly or seriously?
I
Not that it matters, but I'm
uh,
intrigued.
I don't know. I don't know, and I did not ask the question,
Of
but
course
I
not.
know the words that he said,
Of course,
right?
of course.
And I think, and honestly, I think I do recall this person also laughed, and I think that also was infuriating. Like, I think
I
the
was
joke
wondering
was
about
right. So
the overtness of it, but I think
yeah, yeah,
we've got a very solid picture of a very particular type of
yeah.
person in my
So
head.
I just I so I honestly at that point in time, I kind of knew in my heart of hearts that I was going to have to leave the company, right? It was just really just a matter of time. And I was having a hard time with that. And I was, you know, like, I was like, I'm going to have this conversation. I keep on bringing stuff up. At some point in time, I'm probably going to have to admit, right, that I need to go. And that was really what was present for me. I didn't articulate that I was going to have to leave the company, but I was like, all right, I'm going to have a conversation nonetheless. Because yeah, I'm gonna have to have a conversation nonetheless. And so there was this person, we talked about this character. Let's make up a name for this person. Let's
It's
call
colleague and
him,
exec, isn't it? It's just colleague and exec.
yeah, let's do colleague. Thank you. Um, so the colleague uh is like, hey, let me drive you home, right? Like, where do you live? And I lived from where we were, like I could have walked home in 10 or 15 minutes. And she's like, no, like let me drive you home. I'm like, all right, cool. So as we were driving down the street, she's like, hey, how about this? Let's stop off at a bar, right? Let's get a drink. I'll buy you a drink. So I was like, okay, cool, no problem. So we go inside of the bar and she buys I remember she bought a shot of tequila and this really sweet disgusting wine, and she proceeds to then share with me how I cannot go and have a conversation with the executive the next day. um and I was like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, let me tell you this, you're not going to go and have this conversation with the executive tomorrow. And then proceeds to tell me I don't recall every single thing that she shared, but there were many things such as if you go and if you go and have this conversation with the executive, you're gonna ruin the company, you're gonna ruin the community, right? She then proceeds to tell me that I need to keep my mouth shut, that I'm experiencing an identity crisis because I can't decide whether I want to be in sales or if I want to be in marketing. She then proceeds to share that I talk too much about being a Black woman and that I should just shut my mouth and do my job. Essentially, she continues just to replay this message of know your place over and over and over again. And so when I'm very much like and it was interesting because in that moment I could see that she was like that my colleague was really like because she was very, how to put this, like very impassioned, very expressive, very it seemed like she was what's the word that I want to use? It was like this unfurling
Animated?
that was happening. What did you say?
Animated?
There, it was animated, but it was almost like someone who's like losing themselves animated.
Right.
In the sense of like it seemed as though like there was something going on with her, right? It wasn't just an angriness. And I remember my response to it was I was curious about what she had to say. I was like, oh wow, it seems like she's really distressed right now. I didn't even recognize the fact that I was like, oh wow, this person is verbally assaulting me right now. And
Wow.
it continues to get worse, right? So I'm like, wait, like where is this? Like I'm curious. Actually, is what's happening. Is I'm like, well, like I was like, it seems like you're really upset right now. Like what's going on? I like wanted to like console her. I remember she just kept on hammering home, and then she started talking about. I remember there was one phrase in particular that she had shared with me. She goes, you have a Black vagina. So what? Stop talking about it. Legitimate words that she had shared with me. She then proceeds to tell, like she just keeps on going and going and going, and it keeps on getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And it's like it's just mean, is what it is. It's just terribly, terribly mean. And I just remember there was one moment where, because like she was still trying to scare me out of having a conversation with the executive the next day. Um, and yeah, so she's trying to scare me out of having a conversation with the executive the next
Mm.
day. And I was resolute. I was like, I just wasn't phased by the antics, is what was happening. And then when she, I think when she realized that I wasn't, even so she had already said like so many awful things, and I think I was probably just so numbed out from everything that was happening, I didn't really recognize like how hurtful the words that she was sharing with me were. And then there came that moment where she goes, if you go and have this conversation with the executive, I will be sure to have you fired. And she was in a position to be able to actually execute on that promise. And that's the moment where I woke up. And I was just like, wait a minute. You can't do that. Right? And she's like, why not? And I was like, because you would be retaliating against me and that's illegal. And so I remember she stood up and she screamed and she like drops her drink and she's like, you and your big words, right? And then she just storms out. And
I'd
that
like
was
to,
it.
I'd like to make one observation on this, if that's okay. One,
Please.
damn, what a what a what a thing to go through. Um, like, yeah, you had shared that you were so nervous about this, and then just somebody else feels scared about themselves and then takes it on. Um, but here's a thought that I had while you were talking about that. This woman was shouting at you. She was giving you quite a bit of verbal abuse about everything. I wonder if you were numb to it because it was things that you'd also said to yourself before she managed to verbalize it on her end. Was that why it didn't have an impact? Because you'd heard it all before, just coming from your own head rather than coming from this random, I'm assuming, white lady that
Nah,
you worked
how'd
with?
you know? Um, I I don't I can't say that I had thought about those things like I believed what she was saying. I think there
Mm.
was the fear that I had that, all right, does it matter if I advocate for myself or not? these folks are only going to see me one way, and that one way isn't what they're willing to receive. So I think that was the fear, was no matter if because as I mentioned, there's these microaggressions that are happening. And it's like, if I can, if I can be more eloquent, if I can do enough research,
It
right?
was it was very interesting when you said the words microaggressions. So in my world, the word microaggression is very much attached to the issue of race.
Yes.
However, when we were talking about it at the beginning, it was almost as though you were picking it up as like a random word to use for something else.
Oh
Um,
no, it's 100% related to race.
and then
That's fully what I meant by it. Was I was
exactly.
the only Black woman in the organization. There were at the time that I left, there would only be 3 Black people, including myself, at that organization.
Um,
Um, I was the only Black leader at that organization as well. And in the state that I worked in, they have a really, really just, it's not even complicated, right? Because say everything within the US when it comes to race is very complicated. But I mean, this was a state that was so abhorrent to Black people that when it constituted as a state, they made slavery illegal because they wanted it to be a white utopia. They're like, don't even have Black people here. Like,
oh
there
wow.
are still sundown laws that are in place in that state, meaning that if you are Black and you are out past a certain time, you are breaking the law. So that is what I mean by like it. So I think there was this recognition that I had, because it's also the hardest part about it was this. You know what? Now that I'm saying this out loud, this is something that it continually pops up for me. Is I I got into sales because I had this vision, right? Being a CEO, and I was like, where do CEOs start? It's like a lot of so, and I was like, I purposely and very intentionally chose sales, right? And I had an experience when I first got in, and I go, I'm on the right path, right? I have a series of experiences like being let go twice in 1 year. And I go, oh man, this sucks, right? And I can bounce back. And so even with that, I thoughtfully chose a company that I felt like I had the best chance at bouncing back at. They were growing, and like by bouncing back was like, all right, I can get promoted very quickly, kind of thing. I was like, I can get back on my path to promotion. I have to be at a company that's growing and growing very quickly because they're going to be
That,
investing a lot.
was that this company?
That's the company where I had that experience at.
So you
And
go
so
from two layoffs in 12 months to a new company. How long did you spend in that new company?
about a year, a little over a year.
A little over a year there, and then you have this experience.
Oh
Is
yeah, it was like on my 1 year, it was like a day after my 1 year anniversary.
and is this then when
And then
you went into the
and then
bookstore?
3 weeks later is when I had my breakdown.
Did you talk to the executive?
I did.
Oh,
The
um,
next day. I
the
did
next day.
talk to the executive the
Good,
next day.
good.
I was not
I can't imagine it went very well.
it it did what it needed to do. The night before, after my colleague stormed out of the bar, there was again, it's like I woke up, I was like aware of like what had just happened. I was like, oh, I can't ignore this, right? And I think there's also that it's that fear that sets in, which is, how am I going to take care of myself? And I don't know that I had put it all together at that time, but there is, for me, that there's something, it's like a thought of some sort that goes, can I actually have the dreams that I have in the body that I occupy? Meaning, can I, so, and so this to me goes, I go to a coach for this stuff of like, all right, the goal attainment piece of things of, it's not just a matter of having goals, but I have a deep seated belief that I have the ability to accomplish those goals. And so there have been and it wasn't just this company, there's been so many experiences that I've had, like, and it's not just work, it's not just work. It's been in school. It's been in sports, which is I I work for or I play for people who, when they see me, they don't see a top performer. It doesn't matter what I do, doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter how hard I work, doesn't matter what I could be the highest scoring person. They don't respect me as I am, who I am. And I mean, I guess like that's like where the bias comes in, right? Really big time. Some of that bias means, okay, I don't get promoted. Sometimes it means I don't get the resources and the training that I need. Sometimes that means I don't get to make the same mistakes that other people get to make. And sometimes that means being verbally harassed and assaulted by a coworker, or being the butt of the jokes for the executives at the company. So I'm constantly for me, at that time that this conversation happened, I think more than anything else, I was just afraid that I'm like, well, what am I gonna do? Like I was like, I had left my ex-husband. I had moved to the States, right? I was like, I don't have any other plans. I don't have any other backup. So for me, more than anything else, it was just like, I think there was this extreme fear that surfaced up. And and so for me, I was in this fearful state for 3 weeks. I was paranoid. I was, um, that was it. Like I was traumatized
Of course. I mean,
from that
paranoid.
experience,
Paranoid
right?
makes
So,
sense because this person who is in the capacity of having you removed from your position, I'm assuming for those 3 weeks did not act on that, and therefore you could wake
oh
up
no,
every morning thinking, today's the
no,
day.
I went in. So what happening was the next day, there was a series of things that I had done. I believe I sent an email to one of the board of directors, and
Okay.
I very professionally, in 3 bullet points, shared with them what exactly had been like, or I was just like, hey, listen, I know that you have I know, like, on this person's website, their personal page, I did some research, like, the inner
The
SDR that I
SDR
have.
in you.
Yeah, and I found a blog post that they had about their own personal journey of trying to figure out how to be more supportive and accommodating, and foster more cultures of diversity and inclusion. And I was like, okay, I see this article that you have. I really like this quote that you have as well. How are you essentially, it's like, how are you working with your portfolio companies on also upholding these values that you yourself say you have? And so then he emailed me back and asked me the question. Um, uh, he's like, I'm still on a journey, and he asked me, he's like, is there something happening at the company that you're at? And I shared with him what was happening. So, that's probably like the day after, because we were also going off for winter holiday. So, no, the day after the conversation with the colleague, not the conversation, but the assault, the verbal assault from my colleague, I went into the company the next day. I actually let the HR person know, I let my boss know, and I let his boss's bosses know what had happened, fairly succinctly. Not too many details. Just, I wanted to let you know if this happened, and I'm not okay. I had my meeting with the executive. I did not let him know anything of that conversation that I had. But and at that point in time, I also had a conversation with a mentor, and because I was like, hey, listen, to my mentor, I was like, I can't make it today. Like, I'm not in a solid space. He's like, call me, please. And I shared with him what was happening, and he very kindly pushed me to go and seek legal counsel. He's like, you need to protect yourself, which I did. And so when I got back from winter break, I took a leave of absence, and I never actually I did go. Yeah, so I never worked at that company again.
You know, I think there's a lot of people that would have just taken her advice. and shut up and said nothing and decided I
I
need
almost
this job, I need
did.
this paycheck, and
No, I almost did. I almost did. I
I think.
there were certain things. There are I didn't I didn't get a lot, like there were people at that company that I wish I had gotten more support from. I'm not gonna lie about that.
Mhm.
That that being said, what I do believe is that there were people who, even though they didn't demonstrate the kind of support that I wish I had had at that time, I do believe these are also people who cared about me. And there were certain and there were certain things that they noticed about me. So like there was characteristic changes that I had. And I remember there was one day in particular, because this was after like after the experience with the colleague. Um, it's like I couldn't even listen to her voice. Like I would hear her voice, and it's like I would shut down
Mhm.
completely. So I remember being at work one day, and I was always the kind of person who wanted to be available. I would do side by side coaching with my team, right? I'd be joking around with folks, everything. And I remember my boss at the time, his desk would, like, if he was standing at his desk, he could see me, right? Like kind of like down the hallway. And so I just remember my colleague walked into work, and she was talking, and it's like my whole body shut down. I remember typing. I was standing up and I was typing. And as soon as I heard her voice, I was like, I can't work. I can't. Even if I wanted to work. So I would have stayed. Honestly, like I probably would have stayed. I couldn't. I just shut down completely. And I was like, I had to put in headphones to try and like block her voice out. My boss noticed. He's like, as soon as you put your headphones in, I knew that there was something wrong, because I was never the kind, I never would put my headphones in. So I think after that, yeah, so that day that's when I was supposed to have the meeting with my mentor, who did not work at that company. Um and he's like, call me, and I let him know what was happening, and he was just like, listen, he's like, unfortunately he had heard of also some horrendous stories that had happened, not at that company but the companies that he had worked for in the past. And he's like, you can't, he's like, you have to seek legal counsel, because like essentially it's like, if you stay, it's just probably going to get worse. He's like, I've seen it happen. So so that's what I did. I met with a lawyer. Um and if that was on a Tuesday, I put in my leave of absence on a Friday.
So you removed yourself from the situation, um, but it's still quite a traumatic thing, and
Oh, it's terrible.
is all of these different things sort of combining for you. It kind of makes sense. I don't want to say the words make sense, but
No, it
it's
does.
less surprising now when we look at it from why you ended up going into your breakdown, because you had these experiences where you were actively fighting against the paradigm that you were in. You had removed yourself from an unsuccessful marriage with an abusive person, and you had come to notice that this is not okay. Therefore, breaking the paradigm of this is what I deserve. You come back and you start working in what, or you start looking for jobs in what you think you're going to be good at, and turns out you're good at something completely else, and you end up working for a company and working for somebody who treats you in a way that you're not expecting to be treated with. And you're successful in this, you're unequivocally successful in it, again breaking the paradigm, and all of a sudden we're starting to believe that this is that there is another way of doing things. You move, you go, okay, let me try this again. You do it again, and then you get let go. But in that 6 month time, there was a lot of chaos. So here we are now looking at this 1 year period in this last company, and you seem to be doing well in a professional sense, but there are these constant and consistent drawbacks, these microaggressions as you call them, and it's this new paradigm coming in of I'm this badass bitch that I'm trying to be, followed by these constant and consistent drawbacks of yeah, but this comment, or but this comment, pulling you back into an older
Yeah,
paradigm.
I don't even think at that company I had that boss lady
No,
mindset.
it was
No.
survival more
It
so than
was,
anything else.
yeah, it was like, as I mentioned, like when I came into sales, I was like, all right, there's this person I'm aspiring to be, right? I'm aspiring to be a boss. Doesn't mean that I am a boss yet, right? But I was like, I'm
That's true.
aspiring to be a boss. And I get into this company and I have an opportunity to show up and show out in magnificent ways.
Uh huh.
And but that was I guess there was that one piece of that was the only area in my life that I could show up and show out in.
And then you were told to know your place.
Right. And then it wasn't, so that first company, no, it was an amazing experience, but I got let go.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Then I go to this other company who promotes me, moves me out west. Then they let me go.
Mm.
And then I have to go. I'm like, who was I to even think I could be a boss? Right. But then it's like I had to pause and I had to go, all right, I can do this. Right. I'm gonna go in here. I'm gonna make something happen. The end,
And,
right? I'm like,
and
I still here's one thing about me. I'm still so there's this book called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again, and it's all about, like, they talk about drive, right?
mm-hmm.
So like there are, let's say there's three main components, three main factors that influence people's drive, right? And therefore people have these characteristics, these traits, they're probably more likely to be a really solid salesperson. The need to achieve. For me, like this, my there's an inner saboteur assessment. My number one inner critic is the high achiever.
Well, that makes sense because of the things we talked about earlier with the pressures that were coming on you from
Yes,
parents. You need to
exactly.
be that lawyer that,
I
you
have
know,
to. Like, I have to achieve. Like, you can't, it's not just a matter of I just need to go in and everything needs to work for me. It's I am willing to do the work required to be ultra successful.
yeah.
That is something that is like that. Well, before in the past, I would just achieve, right? Kind of like, okay, whatever, I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna just do whatever I need to do. And the past year or two, I've been like, actually in sales, sales was the first time when I got into sales, it was like, no, I am going to work, like, period.
Mm.
So for me, there is that need to achieve, and that stays consistent. The second part is there's the thrill, takes thrill in competition. I grew up playing sports, right? Some of the best times that I had were on a court of some sort. Some of the best lead, like some of the best leaders, the best leaders I've ever had were my sports coaches when I was growing up. It's actually a couple. My first basketball coach, Mr. Pancratz, and then my high school volleyball coach, Mrs. Pancratz, right? They were the best. And then there's this third one, which is optimism. It's a deep-seated belief in one's abilities, deep-seated belief in one's abilities to
Which
make
we
things
ticked off
happen.
earlier.
I have those three things. So like I think there is this piece of no matter what gets thrown my way, I am who I am. I have the characteristics that I have. Doesn't even matter like the beliefs that I've carried with me. I've always had those three things.
Which explains why now, after all of this, you're still in the world of sales. You're still very much in the world of tech sales.
Yeah,
Um,
so there
and
is
you've
I
landed
was gonna say, I
what?
was like, I'm learning how to bring this in rather than it just being in sales. I'm learning how to, this is something I'm working on with my coach right now, which is, okay, work has been an outlet, school's been an outlet where I can express those three things
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit. But if I, as I mentioned, if I could only experience something like showing up and showing out at work, right? Like then all of my satisfaction and fulfillment is contingent upon work.
So
So
how do you
the
take that into
challenge is,
other areas of your life?
yeah, the challenge for me is, or the opportunity for me is, okay, like I've definitely, like, here's the experience that happened. I had my breakdown. I also, during that time, got in trouble with the cops, got a misdemeanor, wasn't working, couldn't get a job, which was frustrating. And as I can look back at it, a total gift
Mm,
because that's where I got to figure myself out as a person.
absolutely. More so than the titles.
I had no title. It was just me.
Who's Gabrielle without the
Gabri-
title?
just and so I had said this. There's a kind of a podcast that I was on a few months ago, and I talked about having, I think I just briefly mentioned I kind of had this breakdown. I wasn't working, and I talked about it's just me and my thoughts. That was it, right? And that's where that quote, that Lao Tzu quote, becomes super super powerful for me. Is again because it goes, all right, hey, like, let me look at what's going on in my world, right? Let me track it back to something. Okay, my thoughts. What do I think about myself? And so I'm like, well, shoot. Again, where did thoughts come from? Oh, they come from beliefs. What do I believe? What are my deep seated beliefs? And so I actually have, during that time that I took off, so number one, my first time I started a journal was when I was 16. I'm 30 now. Um, and I had probably from 16 to 27, right up until that breakdown, I had probably only written or finished, let's say, 7 journals.
Mm-hmm.
So seven, right? So I'm about 30 now. I have now completed 37 journals.
So 30 in the last 3 years.
And even in the past year, I've only done one.
Well, that makes a lot of sense,
So
because you went
yeah, so
through this period of time where everything was changing. You're figuring out who you were, what these beliefs were, and
yeah,
how to challenge them.
yeah. So
Um,
and so a big part of what enabled me to do that was I just wrote down every single thing that I thought. And I would write it down and I would just look at it. And that's how I got to challenge it. Like I'd go, ooh, do I really believe that? Do I want to believe that? No, I don't. So I would reverse it. Like, so if I thought, wow, just give me an example. If I was just like, oh man, I was so stupid, I'd go like, I'm smart, right? It's like, well, I can learn, So I had that. I would find tools I'd find tools to help me explore my own psyche, my own beliefs, the way that I perceived the world, the way I perceived myself, especially. So I started to explore a lot of divination tools like tarot cards. I got crystals to try and figure out, okay, like how can I tune into these different energies? And so I actually, like, during that time off, I, more than anything else, because like I feel like with that breakdown experience that I had was I got to see like, oh hey, like life has been rough. It's just been rough. Like it's been tough. It's been heavy, and I was in a state where I could appreciate all of it. Like there was no doubting. It was that happened. Oh, like if anything, it was I think it was more so this experience of really being able to hold the full magnitude of my grief all at once, which was incredibly overwhelming, hence the breakdown. But also it's just one of the experiences that I had to have, I feel like, to recognize I can't just sweep things under the rug anymore. Like I got to get rid of that altogether. So then when I came out, I had to learn how to hold space for my grief. I had to learn how to hold space for my emotions. I had to learn how to like okay, cool, what is the belief set
well, it
that's
sounds
going
like
to help enable me to do this? So like for me, it's like I like during the breakdown, everything, like we ripped out the whole house, ripped out the foundation, and then it's like, all right, like let's start from new and let me build something that's going to be sustainable for myself.
And I think next week, I think we're going to target exactly that. We're going to target what you rebuilt, how you rebuilt it,
Yeah.
why you rebuilt it. Today, we have looked at why you did what you did between the ages of 10 and 27. And looking down at my notes here, something that's really popping out, and I think a big element of the why was that initial paradigm. It was that initial paradigm of I don't deserve X. And that was why you did what you did and why you accepted what you accepted and why things. And it's been very interesting. I think your actual, now I'm going to be a little bit biased in this, but I feel like the beginning of your career into sales actually was a beginning of a journey out of that. In that it gave you quite a bit of quite a bit of performance in an area that you could perform really well in.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to target the rest of that next week. Um, Damn, today got heavy, didn't it? I love it.
Today did heavy. There's one thing I'm gonna say this, like the belief there is the I don't deserve X. I think there's something that's more that's under it, which is I am not blank enough.
I am not blank enough. Well,
Right. So, because then it's like I'm not blank enough to be deserving of.
are you enough now?
So funny enough, like I have a password. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is, but it's an affirming statement.
Anybody trying to get into Gabrielle's computer now,
No, it's
just like
affirming
plug
statement. It
every
affirms.
affirmation
Affirms.
that you can find.
Yeah, no, it does affirm that is and honestly that's been more recent, right? Of like especially I shared with you some of the things that were happening. We're not going to mention it here, but I shared with you some of the things that are happening more recently. And I'm really, really more than anything else super grateful for the experiences that I've had in the past, because had I not gone through it, learned how to rebound from it, like reinforced my belief, not even just like gotten rid of or become aware of the belief systems that would trigger me into going, oh, I deserve this bad thing or this terrible experience, but instead to go, you know what, no,
Because the experience that you're going through now is a common experience, which you
it's
don't have to necessarily accept, but
no,
it's
I
not.
can
It's also
I
doesn't seem to be one of those things whereby you can.
it doesn't serve me.
No,
I think that's the big part,
but
right?
it's
Which
also
is
not extreme enough to warrant an extreme reaction. It's one of
I
those
don't
things that I think you could
I'm
tolerate.
not gonna but yeah, that's a big thing. Like, or I think about that where I go, it doesn't warrant an extreme reaction, and I don't want it to get to the extreme. Been there, done that, cost me a lot.
Well, you've learned that what you do want to and do not want to tolerate so far,
Yeah.
and I
The
think
journey, right? I was like, I'm not gonna miss that call again.
no, absolutely not.
No, no.
Well, look, thank you very much for joining me today. I think today is going to be an exceptionally long episode, although I'm really glad that it is. And I will catch up with you next week when we look at why you do what you do now, why you do what you do today.
All right, sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. And there we have it. Today's episode was a slog. Today we learned about how Gabrielle came to learn about her own thought patterns and how decided whether or not they were serving her. We learned about her relationship with her dad, how she grew a strength that she didn't know that she'd had, and how she got knocked down both in normal life and in her work life. And then of course there's that incident that we talked about for the last 40 minutes, which brought us down the realm of racism and overt racism in the workplace. Today's episode was different. Today's episode is one that I have never experienced before, and there was a lot of learnings out of today. Gabrielle has been very, very strong through all of this, and has come through it with a mindset of I'm quite weak. It's interesting for those of us on the outside how she could be going through quite a few of these different things and still considering herself to be not enough. And that's a mindset that she's had, and it looks like that she could be predispositioned to have for a while. This idea of I'm not enough. If you have the same predisposition, if you are listening to this and it has triggered things for you, I hope Gabrielle's story will be able to tell you that you are. Because as we talk to her, as we hear from her, we don't get the sense of somebody being weak, even though that's their own interpretation of themselves. Or was. Thankfully, she's changed her mind about herself quite recently. Gabrielle's why has become a curiosity about herself, and I hope her learning about why she does what she does has helped you to learn why you do what you do. Next week, we talk about something else, and I hope you'll come and join us then. Until then, have a good evening.